as you heard earlier, I used to be the executive director at Craigslist Foundation. Joseph Muzan was one of my most active and helpful board members. So I'm really happy to be here. And essentially, the book that recently came out is directly based on my experience at Craigslist Foundation. Anybody here ever get to work on or help with nonprofit boot camp? I know Heidi's here. A couple other folks, Joseph. So I started Craigslist Foundation, kind of restarted it out of my bedroom with no mission, no programs, no staff, no budget, a board of 3 people that had no nonprofit experience, and basically had to figure out what the organization should do. And in short, after going through kind of a soul-searching process with Craig and the founders of Craigslist, with the board at the time, identified this focus on, if you really look at what Craigslist itself does, it's about people helping people. And so for me, the mirror image of that as we applied it to the nonprofit space was about helping people help. And instead of focusing on supporting one individual cause or organization, how could we really advance the entire sector by making all organizations more efficient and more effective? And in particular, rather than kind of duplicating efforts and reinventing the wheel, how could we connect them to resources that were already out there, like Tides, like TechSoup, like Inten, like AFP, like the Foundation Center, that are doing great work, but especially the little guys weren't really that familiar with those incredible resources. And so that was the focus of Nonprofit Bootcamp. We had over 100 partner organizations help us with that, over 10,000 graduates in San Francisco and New York. Folks really loved it. We had very high approval ratings, and it was kind of a transformative program. And as I was transitioning out of Craigslist Foundation, I didn't want to just let all of the relationships and the knowledge that I gained during my 5 years there kind of fade away. And so I was literally looking for a bookend to my efforts. And so worked with the folks at Josie Bass at Wiley on putting this book project together, which is essentially boot camp as a book. And the idea is that everything I do has this sort of practical tips and tools emphasis to it. And so I mobilized 50 of the leading experts that I had come across, folks like Paul Hawken, Lynn Twist, Ami Dar from Idealist, Beth Cantor, etc. Folks that were well recognized and had a lot of expertise, but were also great at being able to concisely and effectively convey practical insights, things that you could put to work tomorrow that would make you more effective and more efficient. That's what boot camp's all about. And so, mapped out a pretty broad array. As you can tell, it's kind of a big book. Don't be intimidated. The 3 kind of words I was going for were practical, comprehensive, which is why it's so big, but also modular. So you can read a chapter in about 20, 30 minutes. And they're all, again, very focused on practical tips and tools. So it covers fundraising, technology, board and volunteers, financial, legal, etc. Kind of the whole soup to nuts thing. All right. And so what I wanted to do today was basically just take a couple of the more salient points from the fundraising section in particular. There's 7 chapters on fundraising, covering everything from foundation grants to corporate giving to earned income, individual donors, online, peer-to-peer giving, etc. And I wanted to lift some of the more salient points that I find can be really helpful for nonprofit leaders and just present those in kind of a very quick, action-packed presentation for you. I'm also very comfortable keeping it interactive, so if folks want to interrupt with questions, please feel free to raise your hand. And the other thing I should mention is that there's also a paper that I've written based on these top 10 tips that you can download for free. So if you go to nonprofits101.org, you can just enter your name and email, and you'll get a free paper version of this talk. And before we start anything, anytime I do a lot of public speaking, especially about development and fundraising, and I feel like I can't really get into the topic without talking about what I see as probably the single greatest problem and obstacle holding back development professionals in the nonprofit sector, which is this kind of tin cup approach to fundraising, which is this sort of begging for alms concept that I think is really endemic in the sector. And so, I take my lessons on this topic from none other than Bill Cosby. Because there's a really great Bill Cosby story that to me speaks volumes to the importance of how to go about fundraising. And so I just want to really quickly convey this before we get into the top 10 tips. So first off, does anybody know where Bill went to college? Yes. He might have gone there for undergrad, but how about for graduate school? I think he went to Temple for undergrad and grad. So he went to Temple University in Philadelphia. I'll check and see if he went to UMass for undergrad. He did? Oh, cool. So he got his master's at Temple University in Philadelphia. And while he was there, he had this philosophy class. And there were 100 master's and doctorate students in this class. And they spent this 1 hour and a half long class. And the entire time, all they did was debate if the glass were half full or half empty. And as you might imagine, it was a pretty circular debate and discussion, and they didn't really get very far. So after an hour and a half of these 100, kind of well-educated folks sitting around in circles and debating each other, getting nowhere, class is over. Bill leaves. He's kind of despondent walking through the Philadelphia streets. He's making a lot of sacrifices, and especially his family are making a lot of sacrifices to put him through school. And he feels like he just wasted a lot of time, as did 100 other people. And so he gets home, and his grandmother's there waiting for him. And she says what grandmas always say when you get home from school: "How was class today, Bill?" And he kind of blows her off and says, no, I really don't want to talk about it. And she presses him and eggs him on and says, no, really, I want to know, how was class today, Bill? And so he says, well, if you got to know, Grandma, it was incredibly frustrating. We had 100 master's and doctorate students sitting around for an hour and a half debating if the glass were half full or half empty. And his grandmother, who's got a second grade education, mind you, without missing a beat, says, oh, that's easy. It depends on if you're pouring or drinking. Pouring or drinking. And I think for me, the reason why that story is so important as it relates to fundraising is that I think all too often in social change work, we think of ourselves as the drinkers. We think of ourselves as begging for alms and as needing support from donors, from foundations, from corporations, the people that support us, and that we have to go to them with this tin cup approach. And in my mind, nothing could be further from the truth. We are the pourers and the nurturers of society. And in particular, as it relates to fundraising, what we're really doing is we're providing people with a channel, with a medium, with a platform through which they can affect the change they want to see in the world. And one of the authors in the book, Kay Sprinkle Grace, likes to say that people don't give to you, they give through you. And I think it's really crucial to realize that you are facilitating impact that these people want to see, that these companies, foundations, and people want to see. And we always have to remember that when we're raising money. So another little celebrity you guys probably know organized this little telethon that raises tens of millions of dollars and over time now billions. And the point I want to make here is, does anybody remember Bob Zimmerman? I hope the book was actually dedicated to him. He wrote a book called Boards That Love Fundraising. He just passed away last year, unfortunately. And he wrote the chapter on getting your board to fundraise in the book. And I wanted to start out with this tip because for me it's one of the biggest aha concepts that came out of the book. It's very easy to implement, but it's also been very effective. Anybody know why EDs leave their job in the nonprofit sector? Number one reason? But why? What burns them out in particular? What kinds of responsibilities or frustrations? Fundraising's number one. How about number two? Yeah, board members. So fundraising responsibility is the number one reason why they leave. And by the way, 50% of executive directors leave their job within 5 years. Most of those leave the sector. So how do we, as a sector, really maintain our talent and develop a pipeline of new leaders? That was the focus of the Next Generation Leadership Council that I helped to start at Craigslist Foundation. And so, given that EDs are frustrated around fundraising and board development, let's look at the intersection of those two things. And that's really what Bob dedicated his career and his life to. And in general, there seems to be a typical pattern, which is that organizations that start out as smaller grassroots groups that eventually find success and start to bring in some money, they have a working board that they eventually want to transition to a fundraising board. And that can be very difficult. And a lot of board members will basically dig their heels in and say, hey, wait a minute, I'm here to do work, not to give money or get money, and I don't like to ask people for money. A lot of people have that kind of natural inclination, at least initially. And so the question is kind of, how can we ease people into fundraising, into development work, and help them understand that it's not just about making the ask, right? Fundraising is an entire process, if not a cycle, that, yes, culminates in making an ask, but there's a lot of work that goes into that, leading up to that point where you're doing research and and developing relationships. And then there's also all of the stewardship and cultivation that goes into nurturing relationships with your existing donors. And so the idea of a thankathon is basically engaging your board in a very easy way to get them on the field as it relates to fundraising, which is ordering a bunch of pizzas, sitting around for 3 or 4 hours, divvying up a set of call lists of your existing supporters, and having your board members just go down the list and call all of your existing supporters and just say thank you. And just convey the impact that their contribution made possible. And then hang up. Don't make an ask, don't invite them to an event. There's no hook, right? So first of all, what you're doing is you're getting your board comfortable with interacting with donors. Number 2, you're helping them realize that they are actually helping support fundraising goals, even if they're not making an ask, so they're part of the process, right? And the other piece of the puzzle is from the donor's perspective, like pretty much you're only used to hearing from someone when they want money or something from you, whether that's in a letter or an email or a call. So to be able to just get a phone call to say thank you, and by the way, here's the impact that you allowed us to make possible, here are the lives that you helped change, that can be very impactful on a lot of different levels. So thanks to Bob for that one. So Tides gives away some grants, and I'm sure a lot of the people in the room, how many people have worked in the foundation community and gone after grants in the past? Quite a few. So I have kind of a cardinal rule around foundation fundraising, and when I was at Craigslist Foundation, we were really successful with the foundation community. About 50% of the grants that we wrote got approved. And almost all of those were based on an LOI, a letter of intent, versus a full-blown grant proposal. And so how do we, what's the trick? And in my mind, the key is never submitting a cold grant. And what I mean by that is I love the Foundation Center. I send so many people to that resource, 312 Sutter Street. But what I don't recommend anybody does is go to the Foundation Center, identify some relevant foundations with programmatic areas of priority that overlap directly with your work, and identify your top list of, here are the 10 foundations that really should be funding us, and then just send them a grant proposal through their website. Maybe not a total waste of time, but pretty close to it. And I never do that, and I never encourage anybody I know to do that, because your time is much better spent warming up a relationship. And I only submit grant proposals if I've been asked to. So the key is, what are the sort of 5 pieces of the puzzle that you need to be aware of, that you should be looking for in order to increase your success rate with foundations? And in general, the key is securing an invitation to apply for funds, right? And so ideally what you're looking for is a phone call or an email, or a phone call or a meeting rather. You can absolutely cold call these people. If you go to the Foundation Center and you get that top 10 list, then pick up the phone. First, see if anybody on your board knows anybody on their board, or if you have any other connections. See if they're going to be speaking at any conferences that you can show up at, or any industry events. But if it comes down to it, it's totally fine to pick up the phone and say, hello, San Francisco Foundation, I'd like to speak to your arts, the program officer in charge of your arts program. And for those of you that don't know, program officer is generally the person who's charged with overseeing philanthropic giving in a particular area of focus. And so build those relationships one way or another, and in the context of that call or that meeting, what you're really looking for is a couple things, all within the umbrella of securing an invitation to apply. So first off, there's what I call the PASTA test, which is basically about programs and positioning. Because it may be the case that the foundation is interested in supporting you with a general operating grant, which is great, and that's what we always want. They also tend to be harder to get than in something focused on a specific program or a specific need. And so what's important is for you to have kind of a whole bunch of elevator pitches in your back pocket that you can throw at the wall and see what sticks. That's the PASTA test. And you start out with the organization as a whole, and then you run through all of your programs, or all of the programs you'd like to launch, and you see what really jives with that funder. And what you're listening for are 2 things. It's about programs, but it's also about positioning. You're listening for, are they more interested in funding Craigslist Foundation as a whole, or Nonprofit Bootcamp? But you're also listening for the why, right? You've done your research. You better not go into a meeting or a call with a funder without at least looking at their website and doing some homework. But there's always additional language, additional thinking that goes into their grant making that you can't find anywhere in public. So you're looking for the little sound bites and catch phrases that describe their approach to giving. With individual donors, you call this appreciative inquiry. Like, what's driving their decision making? And you want to write those phrases down because you want to include those in your grant proposal, in your LOI, as you follow up. So you're basically looking for what should we be asking for money for and why, and look at that language. The next piece is by when and how much. So yes, they might have some deadlines and timelines published on their website, but there may be some internal timelines that would make it more convenient for them. So just ask them, when would you like me to get this to you by? And also, and very few people actually do this, but go ahead and ask them, like, what is a reasonable amount to request? You know, should we ask for complete underwriting of this $250,000 program, or should we focus on a $100,000 ask? You know, what's the sweet spot for first-time grantees is usually what I would ask people. And they will give you a number. Right? And so now all of a sudden what you have is, I'd like to invite you to apply for a grant of $50,000 for this program for these reasons by the 30th. That's an invitation, right? That's much better than going off a website and sending something in cold. And the final piece of the puzzle, what I think of as kind of the Jedi mind trick, and I love this little trick, is that I actually ask program officers if they're willing to review a draft of the proposal before it's formally submitted. And the reality is, everybody I've ever asked always said yes. The vast majority of them never did it, but that's okay, because the important thing is not the edits that they get back to you with. The important thing is that you're essentially asking them to adopt your proposal, your project. Because once they have said, yes, I will review it and, you know, submit it, they're essentially endorsing your grant, and then they're presenting it internally, which is the job of a program officer. And I know, as someone who's worked on the board of a small arts foundation, that when I worked with a potential grantee to refine their proposal, and then I presented it internally, and I was passionate about it, it always got approved. So the same thing's true at a larger scale. So go ahead and ask them. And again, think about that. I'd like to invite you to apply for $100,000 for this program for these reasons by next Tuesday, and I'll look at a draft before it gets formally submitted. That's the kind of ask you're looking for. So kind of tough to see in this picture, but does anybody recognize this guy? Hank Rosso? Anybody know that name? Joseph, I know you know Hank Rosso, no? So Hank was basically the father of professional fundraising. And he had a lot of famous sayings, but one of the biggest ones is, what's the #1 reason why people don't give? What's that? Yeah, the #1 reason why people don't give is they're not asked. So that's kind of one of the things that Hank is most famous for saying. And the key here, and what really comes through in the book, is the importance of making direct and specific asks, right? It's not enough to just talk to somebody about the work of your organization and then stop and expect them to say, wow, you guys are great, I'd like to give you $1 million. At some point in the conversation, you literally and explicitly need to say, I'd like to invite you to join me with a contribution of $50,000, of $20,000, of $10, whatever it is, but it's a number that's based on whatever research you can do and sort of your best guess of what's a reasonable request. And you're also pausing, and you're letting the silence just sit there for a minute after you make that ask until you get an answer. I just got engaged, and when I asked my fiance to marry me, there was like this very uncomfortable silence, but you got to wait. You can't just fill that awkward silence. You need to ask the question and give them the time to answer. I had to ask twice, actually. You know, and I think, again, back to this concept of appreciative inquiry, by the time you're asking, hopefully you have an even better sense of why they give in general, what their connection is to your organization and your cause, and specifically, is there a component of the puzzle that they're most passionate about and that they'd be most interested in supporting. And so the key here is, again, direct and specific asks. So I mentioned Kay Sprinkle Grace earlier, and she's local. She wrote the chapter on individual donors and fundraising. Phenomenal expert that has so many zingers, I can barely remember them all. But I talked earlier about this idea of people don't give to you, they give through you. And really what Kay is getting at here is this concept, and this was a theme that I saw in every single chapter throughout the fundraising section, is that you need to map donations to impact. If people can't understand the incremental impact, not what your organization is doing as a whole, but if this is your trajectory and this is the impact you're going to have already, and with a donation of X, you'll be able to do this, this is what you're selling, right? It's that delta. It's that difference of, with your help, we're going to build this new wing to the hospital. With your help, we're going to buy a mosquito net, or whatever it is. It doesn't have to be a building. It can be something very small. It's kind of the Sally Struthers approach, right? So, but ultimately, it's about mapping donations to impact and remembering that whether you're in, a meeting and you're making an ask, whether it's on your website, etc. The other thing that Kay likes to say is that people don't give to you because you have needs, they give to you because you meet needs. And that has a couple implications because first off, I think there's, all too often you see the kind of desperation letter where it's like, oh no, the economy's falling apart and if we don't get $10,000 by Tuesday, we're going to have to close our doors. Just go ahead and close your doors. You're never going to get funding based off an ask like that. Nobody wants to join a sinking ship. So the alternative is, with your help, we've established a tradition of excellence and we've, changed 10,000 lives in this concrete way and the numbers show this, etc. And we're now coming back to you because here's an opportunity to take it to the next level. Right? So it's all framing, it's all positioning. But again, just remember that nobody wants to join a sinking ship and, people are giving to you because you're meeting needs. So it's about, again, mapping donations to impact. Some of you guys might know the folks at Network for Good. I know Joseph has worked with them pretty closely. And Katya Andreessen and Rebecca Heyman wrote the chapter on online fundraising. And what's really interesting is, before I got into the nonprofit sector, I kind of think of myself as a dot-com refugee because I started one of the first digital advertising agencies. And right out of college, we started this company that eventually grew to about 400 people in 28 countries. And the coolest part about it is there were 22 married couples that came out of the company. So I was the only co-founder of 4 that didn't marry an employee. And as I was traveling around the world as our chief interactive evangelist and educating CEOs of traditional ad agencies on how interactive marketing was fundamentally different than traditional advertising, one of the things that I like to talk about back then, and it's still really relevant, and especially in the world of Google Analytics and social media, this is increasingly important, is that the fundamental nature of accountability has changed as it relates to marketing. And what I mean by that, excuse me, what I mean by that is that now, because of technology, because of the internet, accountability is direct, it's immediate, and it's complete. Direct, immediate, and complete. And what I'm getting at is that, let's take the old world model of accountability, of measurement, right? If you're Coca-Cola and you're running a Super Bowl ad, or you're at the Olympics or whatever, right? What's the best case scenario if you're really well resourced? You're probably going to do some focus groups and show a couple hundred people if you're lucky, a few different ads. You're going to ask them what might they do based on seeing this ad. And then you're going to take a few weeks or a few months to tabulate that information and try and turn that data into some kind of useful insights. Okay. So what happens now, right? Direct, immediate, and complete. Direct. You're not asking people what they think they might do based on seeing this ad. You're showing it to them and you're watching what they actually do. Right? Immediate. You're not taking weeks or months to tabulate information. It's all real-time data that's tabulated for you. And there's great free tools out there like Google Analytics. And it's complete. You're not doing a representative sampling by asking a couple hundred people if 2 million folks are going to see your ad. You're going to see what every single one of them actually does in real time. So the point here is that now that we have this information at our fingertips, how do we use it? And the answer, in science, they talk a lot about A-B splits, right? And in marketing as well. Because what you can do, and for example, what the folks at Network for Good did is they just changed their donate button on their website one day, just as an experiment. What would happen if we change our donate button from gray to red? 30% increase in donations immediately. Like changing the color of a button. So the point is, you should be playing around, maybe not all the time, because you don't want a carnival where every time somebody comes to you, they don't know what to expect, but make some strategic decisions about how to optimize your online presence. And I should mention that those of you that are specifically interested in social media might be interested in knowing that we're working with a bunch of different folks, including Network for Good, Idealist, and Beth Cantor, Guy Kawasaki, and we've launched this whole nationwide conference series on social media for nonprofits. And Tides is actually sponsoring a whole bunch of scholarships for that. We've already done San Francisco, DC, and New York. We're heading to LA next week. We're doing 9 events in 7 cities, and we'll be back in San Francisco in early November. We haven't released that date yet. But basically, the focus of that series is all on practical tips and tools for fundraising, marketing, and advocacy through the use of social media. And there's a really great website, too, that has a lot of content on it, which is socialmedia4nonprofits.org. And it's the number 4. So social media, the number 4, nonprofits.org. I would also encourage you guys to follow us on Facebook and Twitter, because we have a pretty active presence there, and we're constantly sending out really useful tips and announcements, etc. So back to the idea of online giving, though, what I wanted to point out is 2 sort of related points around online giving that are really crucial and that kind of move the needle from a standpoint of donations. One is, how many clicks does it take someone to actually donate through your website? From any place in your website, if it takes more than 3 clicks to actually process a donation, then the bottom line is if you look at the statistics and you look at the analytics, you are losing a good chunk of people at every click. And if it's more than 3 clicks, you're going to lose the majority of folks that were in the process of trying to give you a donation. It's almost like putting several doors to get in through the entrance of a store. You just want to go in and buy a pair of jeans. So how can you make it easier for people? And one of the most important ways is through streamlining the online giving process. The other piece is, people know about Heifer International? You know, like sponsor a cow and stuff, yeah. So this is the mosquito net model, the Sally Struthers thing I was talking about before, which is what these guys have done really well, is that, you know, you can donate to provide a cow for a family in sub-Saharan Africa. Just like other groups say you can donate to provide a mosquito net for one family. And that's the $25 level, and then at the $100 level, it's put a kid through school for a year. So whatever it is for you, take the time to sort of look at your mission, at your impact, and how to personalize that so that somebody can really get that delta of the impact their donation is going to make. One other website I should mention, if people haven't checked out Charity Water before, these guys are doing such a phenomenal job of mapping donations to impact. Literally, you're giving your birthday away to charity, you're raising $5,000, and then you can go on their website, look at the GPS of where the well is that they just built in Uganda, see pictures and videos of them drilling it and the water coming up and the villagers going nuts. And I mean, it's so personalized, and they really have the use of technology dialed in such a way that I highly recommend you checking those guys out. Yeah, I mean, I think especially in this age where we're used to instant gratification and where you're in the driver's seat, if somebody wants to donate to you, don't get in their way, right? Make it as easy as possible, make it as streamlined as possible, and not only make the process of donor acquisition, that transaction, as easily as possible, but how can you turn that donor into a fundraiser through the use of some of this digital technology? How can you give them the tools, whether it's as simple as a physical card, or whether it's forward this on to 3 friends, or post your donation to Facebook? How can you tap the power of social networks to enable and empower each and every one of your donors to tap their networks and raise money on your behalf? So why is everybody so excited about social networking, right? What's the big deal? And I'll tell you in short, which is, how many people were on Facebook in the last month? Okay, almost everybody. How many people in the world were on Facebook in the last month? Anybody got a guess? Numbers? You can cheat and just look at the screen behind me. Okay, this is about 2 months old, so now it's up to 700 million. Because every month, Facebook grows by the entire subscription base of the LA Times. Right? There's now over 700 million active users of Facebook, making it the 3rd largest country on the planet. And that's just counting people that have used it within the last 30 days. Anybody know what the fastest growing demographic on Facebook is? Who's getting on Facebook right now? Women ages 45 and plus. So this is not just like those kids doing their wacky thing anymore. Right? This is a mainstream movement that everybody is now part of. Twitter, I should mention, is now over 200 million people. Took me a while to wrap my head around the whole, like, what are you doing right now thing? But now that I've kind of gotten into it, I understand the value of it, because it's your finger is on the pulse of what's happening in the world and in society. It's how I found out about Gil Scott-Heron. It's how I found out about, you know, a lot of stuff before the media released it, about an hour before, pretty consistently. So people want direct access to information, especially in the wake of Wisconsin and Egypt, as just two examples, right? And so the question is, ultimately, social media is a tool. And as such, if it doesn't make your work easier, if it doesn't help, then don't use it, right? But it does have tremendous opportunity. And I know we're talking about tips here, but I will give you an anti-tip, which is the one thing that I would recommend you not do as it relates to social media, is relegate this to some kind of like intern experiment and do what I call is the empty store phenomenon, which is basically you've got a summer intern, oh, let's have them set us up on Facebook or on Twitter, and then they disappear and you go dark. Like, don't do that. It's better not to do it to begin with than to do it without a plan and a commitment to post once a week, to at least engage your audience. If people are taking the time to follow you, to like you, then give them an ongoing reason to do that and build your relationship with them. Yeah?
Does that advice change depending on the demographics? Like for a capacity building organization?
It doesn't change. I mean, there's a whole discussion that would change, to your point, about would I recommend you engage in social media activity, right? If you do, it is always the case that you should be committed to it, right? The question is, should you or should you not? And that's a much more complicated question that is sort of individualized based on the organization. And it's based on a couple different criteria. One is your audience on these platforms, right? If none of your people are on Facebook or Twitter, then don't go there. Maybe you're an international NGO and your folks are on some of the counterparts that are big in China or India. Set it up there. Right? You know, if they're not anywhere and you want to build a platform, then maybe you can piggyback off an existing site like this, or maybe you use something like Ning to build your own social network. A lot of folks do that instead of tapping into the community where they're already at. I'll get to your question in one sec. And, you know, and the other thing is what do you want to use it for? So even if they are there, there has to be a compelling reason why these platforms are an extension of your mission and your ability to meet mission. So if you're an organization that has a lot of activity and you want to create a channel to constantly update people about all the great work you're doing, then yes, it could be great. What it also does is it opens up conversations, so it's not just you talking at people, but social media is basically the great equalizer. It opens up the ability for a dialogue to take place. If that's of interest and if that's valuable, which it should be for most nonprofits, then that's another reason to consider. Right? You had a question? The question was all about privacy. And basically, is it okay if you've promised your donors you're not going to release their information to a third party to send them an invite through Facebook, in which case you're sharing their information with Facebook? You know, I would, so it is a moving target. Things have changed a bit. Facebook caught a lot of heat about 6 months ago around its privacy policies, and they've changed pretty substantially. So they've made it very easy for you to say, I don't want you to, you know, to give this information to anybody else. I don't want you to use it for any purposes, etc. So the way it's set up now, it's basically like the Postal Service. You know, when you're sending a letter to someone through a medium, technically you're giving the Postal Service, you know, someone's address, but you know, so I wouldn't have a problem with that personally. At this point, the way things have been changed, again, they've made it really easy for you to say, this information is private, don't share it, don't use it, etc. So I probably wouldn't have said that as readily 6 to 8 months ago. Yeah? Yeah. So the question was around fundraising through Facebook, right? So we've got 700 million people at a party. Can we turn it into a fundraiser? Like, how does that work? And the answer is it works in a couple different ways. We don't have time to go too far into detail. There's a whole chapter on it, but what I will say is there's really 3 different kind of key platforms. So one is Facebook Pages, one is setting up a Facebook group, and the final one is Facebook Causes. And Causes is an application that's sort of built specifically for Facebook. They've helped nonprofits raise over $40 million to date. So there's definitely quite a few different ways to use those different platforms. There is a pretty substantial ability to raise money through Facebook, through these platforms. You can also raise money through Twitter. Beth Cantor was the first person to do fundraising through Twitter and has written quite a bit about that. But I think the important piece to remember here is that all too often as nonprofit professionals, when we hear about kind of a new opportunity, our mind immediately goes to fundraising and immediately goes to how can we use this to bring more money in the door. And yes, it's a powerful tool for that, but it's also really valuable for a couple other things, and it's kind of uniquely suited for a couple other things. One is this whole idea of something going viral, right? Because all of a sudden you can put together a great video about your organization, and boom, if people really like it, they can send it out. I don't know if people have seen the Story of Stuff. 10 million people have seen that, right? And that was designed by a little organization with a very little following, and boom, it blew up and brought a lot of attention. I know, yeah. So, that's one really great example. It's also, from a marketing and an advocacy standpoint, the other piece that people don't often enough think about the power of social media and this ability to engage in dialogue is it's a really great medium for thanking people, right? Part of what technology can enable is the sort of holy grail of treating every $20 donor like you would a $1,000 donor. And whether that's putting up a little Facebook post or a tweet or whatever, just saying thank you, that goes a long way to nurturing your most active supporters. The other thing I would say that's touched on in the book is it becomes really important once you start using technology to recognize people not only for the gifts that they give, but for the gifts that they bring. Because when you start looking at social fundraising, social media plus fundraising, I might only give 20 bucks, but if I get everybody in the room to give 20, you shouldn't treat me like a $20 donor, should you? Right? So that's a really important thing to keep in mind as well. So let's get into corporate partnerships a bit, because I think this is a really interesting area. Do folks know what percentage of philanthropic giving comes from corporations about? 1%? Other? Okay, it's about 7%. It's about 7% from corporations, 8% from foundations, and about 85% from people like you and me. And that's typically coming in gifts of $100 or less from people that make under $100,000 a year. That's where the lion's share of over $300 billion a year is coming from. And it's really important to remember that. But as it relates to corporate partnerships, I want to say a couple things. So first off, as far back as 2000, Newsweek talked about this concept that checkbook philanthropy is dead, and that people don't just want to write checks anymore. I don't necessarily agree with that. Some people do. And I think what's important to remember as folks talk about slacktivists, I don't know if you've heard this new term, I have kind of a big beef with that term, because for me, different people show up for different causes in different ways at different times, depending on the context. I might care a lot about animal cruelty, but I don't care as much about climate change. So I'm willing to donate to this cause, but only like this cause. And even within a cause that I really care about, if my sister brings it up to me and says, hey, will you support me? I'm going to walk 100 miles, then yes, I'm going to give money. If somebody I don't know sends me some spam, I'm probably just going to delete it, right? So it's really important to remember the key here, which is meeting people where they're at and essentially creating a spectrum of engagement that might start with liking us or forwarding something or signing a petition, but it might culminate in serving as a board member and becoming a major donor. And so what are all the points of intersection and the touch points with those possible supporters in between? And this is something, I don't know if you guys know Michael Franti and Spearhead. They're a band here in the Bay Area, and I work with them on this annual Power to the Peaceful Festival we do every year. So we get about 80,000 people out to a free concert in Golden Gate Park for peace and social justice. That's great, but what do we do after we get 80,000 people there? Do we just let them drive home? Or do we give them opportunities for engagement that might start with, hey, text to donate? Then it might go to join us tomorrow if you're interested in playing a leadership role in building a better world. Then it might culminate in sign up for a 3-month, intensive leadership course on starting your own organization. So what are those points of engagement and thinking through those? And back to the corporate piece, I think one of the things that I want to talk about is beer, because I like beer. But anybody know Lagunitas? Local brewery, organic, really good. So I think all too often when people think about corporate giving, they're only thinking about the financial side, and they're not thinking about in-kind. And so that's what I really want to talk about. Beer was just a joke. Because when you're putting on an event or when you're running an organization, for-profit, nonprofit, or otherwise, Econ 101 is that profits equals revenue minus expenses. And so as fundraising professionals or as nonprofit professionals doing development work, we sometimes focus too much on the revenue side and not enough on the expense side. So how can you decrease your expenses by getting in-kind donations? And one of those is through getting stuff donated. Lagunitas is incredibly generous and has basically never said no to any nonprofit that I know. Google does have some cash grants available, but how many of you know about Google grants? Okay? Pretty much every nonprofit in the country that's a 501c3 should have a Google grant. You can sign up and you get $10,000 a month of free advertising, free AdWords on Google. Google.com/grants. So that's a really easy thing to get. They're very generous with those. And all of a sudden you've got 10 grand a month to spend on advertising to drive donations, drive awareness, drive advocacy efforts, etc. That's great. Much easier to get than getting actual cash out of Google. Trust me, I've tried. The other piece of the puzzle here from in-kind is media partnerships. So I mentioned the Social Media for Nonprofits series. We've got a variety of media sponsors, including the Chronicle of Philanthropy, Nonprofit Technology News, etc. Right? And these are all media platforms that have pretty large, readership that are in a really great position to spread the word about what we're doing. When I was at Craigslist Foundation, we had Cron Channel 4 or KGO Radio or The Weekly and The Guardian. Great. If you're going to do an event, if you're going to run any kind of program, who are the media vehicles that are in a position to put you in touch with possible supporters and participants and get them on board? They're looking for these partnerships. Then finally, I want to talk about volunteerism, because this is another really great way to engage corporate partners, which is going to them and asking them, hey, we're doing Nonprofit Bootcamp and we need 200 volunteers. We'd love to have Deloitte send us over a crew of 20 people all wearing your t-shirts. But what's one of the biggest trends, and now we're getting a little bit more macro than the very practical fundraising tips, but I think it's important to take a step back as we talk about volunteerism, because for me, this is where a philanthropic revolution is going to take place in our lifetime. What I mean by that is that the fundamental concept and the nature of volunteerism will change in each and every one of our lifetimes. I promise you that. And in particular, what I'm getting at is that traditionally when we think of volunteering, we think of pouring soup or licking envelopes or filing things or something that basically anybody could do, and it's really just you're volunteering your time. But what does it look like to basically do pro bono service? What does it look like to volunteer your network, your expertise? If you were a carpenter for 30 years to build a house with Habitat, if you were an accountant to help a nonprofit balance their books, right? And all of the research that's coming out now, especially looking at baby boomers, shows that they don't want to just volunteer their time. They want to volunteer their expertise in their network. And so the issue is we have kind of a catch-22, because nonprofits have a set way of thinking about volunteers and people have a set way of thinking about volunteerism. So there's groups like Taproot Foundation that's really been leading the charge on this, Civic Ventures, a couple other groups that are really looking at promoting this concept of pro bono service and skills-based volunteerism. So think about that as you're looking to engage volunteers, and think about, are there ways that you can kind of zero out some expense lines in your budget? I mentioned the Google grant piece already, so I'm going to skip through this part, but again, it's $10,000 a month of free advertising. Google also has a variety of other tools they make available for free to nonprofits. So if you go to google.com/nonprofits, They have Google Analytics, Google Checkout, a bunch of stuff you can get free access to. I should also mention, because there was the question about Facebook earlier, that you can go to facebook.com/nonprofits, and they just launched a Facebook Nonprofit Resource Center that's quite robust. So I would be sure to check that out. And also our friends at Network for Good launched a website called fundraising123.org, which is all about online fundraising. Really powerful. Okay, pop quiz. Anybody recognize any of these people? Who's this guy? Ronnie Lott. Kamala? I don't know who that is. Who's that? Daniel Lurie, yeah. Anybody know who Daniel Lurie is besides you? Tipping Point Foundation, right? Tipping Point Community. So I volunteered at an event for these guys maybe 2 months ago, and they raised over $7 million in one night. $7.2 million, right? They also had Beck playing. I mean, it was a party. It was pretty cool. And they do it every year, and it's based off the Robin Hood Foundation in New York, which has a similar model. They raise over $10 million in one night, all focused on, all of which gets given away to local organizations combating poverty. The board covers all the operating expenses. So great organization, doing great work. I'm involved with them in a couple different ways, but the point I wanted to make here is when Marika Holmgren wrote the chapter on event planning, she raised a really important point, which is when you're planning fundraising events, which most nonprofits do, take the time to actually map out a budget, right? And look at a realistic perspective of what is it going to cost you to put this event on. And include a miscellaneous line item, but try and do the homework you need to do to figure out what is your venue going to cost, what is your AV going to cost. Don't expect everything can get donated. And then also do on the revenue side, what are you forecasting? And if you're not bringing in at least twice as much money as you're going to spend, and this is just your budget. In general, as we all know, you wind up spending more money and making less for the most part. We can't all be tipping point. But if you're not at least making double and you have a 2-to-1 ratio, then you might want to reconsider it. And maybe it's okay to do a friend raiser or a fundraiser, but it ain't a fundraiser. And just go into it with that awareness and that perspective so you can have more realistic expectations. And finally, I wanted to share a tip on social capital and on earned income. Folks might be familiar with Rick Aubrey. He started Rubicon programs, and now he's moved on to do something called New Foundry Ventures, basically an incubator for social enterprises across the country. And he wrote the chapter on earned income. And you know, part of what he talks about is fundraising within the context of a social enterprise, because a lot of nonprofits, especially given the current economic downturn, are looking at how can we diversify our revenue? How can we bring money in from other sources? And is there an opportunity for us to leverage our expertise? Right now, in fact, I'm working with the Center for Environmental Health. Some people might know them. You know, they've been doing amazing work for decades, and they're looking now at could they potentially parlay that expertise, those relationships, into an earned income stream, which would basically be a consultancy, working with businesses on greening their operations or their products. You know, seems like it makes sense, it fits the mission, etc. So we're doing a feasibility study for them. But you know, what's important and crucial to keep in mind as you do this is a couple different things. Number one is this concept that if it doesn't advance your mission, then forget it, right? There might be a lot of money in creating a hamburger joint, but if you're there to teach arts to the kids, unless somehow the kids are drawing the hamburger packaging or whatever, it doesn't make sense. And this is probably the single point that Rick came back to time and time again in his chapter, is that the work of the social enterprise needs to advance your mission. Just like with Rubicon, they were employing people with mental handicaps, with emotional disabilities, and teaching them how to get into landscaping, into running a bakery. Great. It's meeting mission. It's a triple bottom line business. So unless it is meeting that social bottom line, and that is directly in line with your nonprofit's mission, then you shouldn't even be considering it. Point number one. But the other point is, as it relates to fundraising, what's really key to know here is that it is much more complicated to raise money for a social enterprise than it is for a private business. And why is that? Any ideas why that might be the case? Yeah. What's that? Security laws? Yeah. So, what's that? No equity, exactly, right? As a nonprofit, you're not allowed to pay out dividends. You can't have profit sharing. You could pay salaries. My grandma never quite got that. You know, I worked at Craigslist Foundation for 5 years, and even at the very end, she would still ask me, like, so how do you get paid again if you work at a nonprofit? But the point is, yes, nonprofits can pay salaries, but you can't have an IPO. You can't, you know, pay out dividends because you had a really good year. And as an investor who's looking for a return, even if it's an impact investor looking for a moderate return, it's pretty complicated to invest in a nonprofit and get paid out dividends based on their profits. So as a result, what happens is it's much more complicated to get access to funding, whether that's from banks and institutions, whether that's from people, etc. And instead of spending about 3 to 5% of your time fundraising, like you usually do with a for-profit business, you're talking more about 20 to 50% of your time. So one of the other, really concrete takeaways around earned income is that if you are planning on going in this direction, then you should absolutely go into it with your eyes open, and you should expect to spend quite a bit more time raising money than you would if you were launching a new for-profit enterprise. I will mention really briefly that there are a couple conferences, what I call the Good New Boys Network. There's a couple conferences where these impact investors hang out. And impact investors are basically people with financial capability, with wealth, that are interested in using that to make the world a better place. And they want to invest in nonprofits and social enterprises in triple bottom line businesses and organizations where they actually get some kind of financial return, but more importantly, where they're advancing social work. RSF Social Finance is right around the block here. They're kind of like a mecca for this. But there's a couple specific events that I would recommend you check out if this is something you're interested in learning more about, or if you're interested in tapping that community. SOCAP is coming up, I think, within the next month over here at Fort Mason. So that's a great one. They just did their first European one. Social Venture Network has a national network of folks, and they do a couple conferences a year. And then finally, there's a group called Investor Circle, where they have mainly for-profit businesses kind of pitch off against each other and address an audience and talk to them about their work. Okay. And I think those were really the tips that I wanted to cover today. I'm happy to leave it open to any questions that people have. I also have some books if folks are interested in checking those out. And yeah, more than anything, I just wanted to say thank you for all the good work that you're doing and for your time. And it's really wonderful to see so many familiar faces. So thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you, Darian. Are there any questions, China?
I just wanted to take your take on the sort of data versus feeling debate. Like, I was at the Social Impact Exchange conference that was in New York. And the idea is, well, high impact nonprofits have this data that proves they work, but then you have people like, but actually all the research says that donors give because they feel personally connected, because they care about it, et cetera, et cetera. Do you have a perspective on how much of that to stress in your fundraising, or how to reconcile those two approaches?
So, I think that the answer is yes. So I think that a couple different things. So one is that, to the extent you can have data and really operationalize your impact and help people understand that, I work with a group called the Women's Initiative here in San Francisco, and the women that go through that program are, home ownership retention goes up by 34%, and the amount of people that wind up going back on welfare, goes down tremendously. And they've got all these really compelling statistics that are hugely important and that have allowed them to raise millions of dollars. But at the same time, there's another side to the coin, which is the stories of those individual women, right? And I think the key thing to remember is don't lead with the numbers, lead with the faces. People don't give to numbers, they don't give to organizations, they give to people, right? And they're not giving because they want to see poverty decrease by 1% in San Francisco. They're giving because they want to see this family stay in their home. And to the extent you can lead with those, personal stories that are really what pull on the heartstrings and get people to donate, and then back it up with, and by the way, this woman is just one of the 10,000 people we serve, and here are 3 really compelling bullet points, of the impact that we have on those 10,000 people. Make sense? Okay. Yeah.
Well, it's scary to see the percentage of donations, like 85% individuals under $100,000 with a huge unemployment percentage. A lot of people who used to donate actually are unemployed now, and it's kind of like, you know, I don't know if I'm the only person feeling these, but it's kind of like, geez, I mean, where should I look now, right? And I mean, should I just wait for a better time? What's your take on that?
So I wouldn't be quite as worried. So yes, we are facing some tough times. The good news is that if you look historically at philanthropic giving from individuals, over any 5-year period, it's never gone down. So, you know, it might dip a little bit when we go through an economic crisis like we are going through, but in general, it always pops back up and it never goes down that much, right? What may go down is sort of discretionary, like somebody just gets a letter and they send out a check type stuff. So it's going to be even more important than ever to make those personal connections, tell the stories, use multimedia like photos and videos to make it more compelling. You know, online giving is actually growing substantially by 35 to 55% per year, depending upon if you're a larger or smaller organization. So giving in general continues to rise, not quite as much as it was before the downturn, but in particular the percentage of the pie going online has been growing really substantially. So I think it's pretty important to look at some of these new technologies and platforms and try and identify how can you use those to connect with donors in new ways.
Just a clarification. It's been about 5 years, but the last time I looked at that, the 85% number of individuals, over half of that went to schools, to their kids' schools, and to their churches. And so it's not necessarily going to nonprofits. I mean, it's going to nonprofits, but it's to ones that they have a really strong connection to. And part of my question around that is, how do you build that kind of strong connection with an individual where it's not going to their child's school or their church?
So that's a great question, and I would say that even more than the 50% that's going to universities, schools, and churches is going to nonprofits that they feel really strongly connected to. So to your point, how do you become one of those instead of just another like, oh, I'll give $20 because somebody asked me type thing? And for me, I think it really goes back to this thing we keep talking about, which is the importance of forming connections through personal stories and through personal impact. So it's really the appreciative inquiry process that I talked about earlier, where if you're in an actual meeting and you have an opportunity to speak with someone, it's identifying like what are the levers, what's driving your giving. What happened to you as a kid that made you passionate about poverty or climate change or education? And looking at how you can basically frame your cause, your mission, your organization as a solution to the problem that person wants to change in the world. And then framing everything that you do through the lens of that being the solution to the problem they're looking to solve with their giving. So to me, that's in essence the key to fundraising, is like, how can you, and it's going to be different with different people, which is why it gets more complicated when you're on a website or you're in a brochure and you have to pursue a lowest common denominator approach. But even in that instance, you're still leading with the faces and then following up with the numbers. Question back here?
Yeah, my question's about mapping donations to impact. So for an organization like Heifer, or any really service provider, where you can say, I can sponsor a cow, it's really easy for people when there's a widget, you know what I mean? But when you're talking about the kinds of organizations that we usually fund, social justice organizations, where there aren't necessarily widgets, you can't sponsor like systemic change. And I know that there's some information out there in terms of the field where people are trying to develop good metrics around things like advocacy and organizing, but in terms of for a smaller scale donor, like what is the widget? What is the impact you map to when you're not talking about a fund my campaign? You know what I mean? What's that?
Can you give a concrete example of a nonprofit that you find most challenging
community organizing groups. I mean, like, or I think that's a pretty straightforward example. Yeah.
So, I think the key here is that, yes, not every group has the equivalent of a mosquito net, and it's not always as cut and dry as that. But there's almost always some way you can slice and dice a contribution so that you're getting at the key, which is that delta, right? Which is that difference in impact. And it might be something as like, sponsor a canvasser, sponsor an organizer, or sponsor an event, or your underwriting support is allowing us to, I don't know, but just off the top of my head, some of the things that are popping in my mind is like, it takes people to do the things that you're doing, and maybe they could sponsor some of those people or some of the activities that go into creating the systemic change. So it's really about kind of getting things down into like bite-sized chunks, and then being able to position them differently, because maybe I'm more interested in the event versus the canvasser. So you can kind of offer those opportunities to people. But I would look at your budget. I would look at the budget and say, where are we spending money? And more importantly, if you had to kind of come up with like an organizational dashboard, and actually Gene Bell from Compass Point wrote a great chapter on that, this is something that the business sector does really well. They have a term called key performance indicators that MBAs like to use. We don't use that in the nonprofit sector. The quote I heard is that we as a sector are overled and undermanaged. So how do we create some tools for management? And part of that is this notion of sort of dreaming your dreams with open eyes in order to make them come true, which is asking the question, what does success look like? How will we know if we've succeeded at organizing the community or at changing policy? And are there steps in that process that we can declare as milestones, that we can map to our financial needs and say, with your help, we'll hit this milestone, right, this piece of the puzzle? Great.
I don't know if you talked about this before I got here, but I have a question about like Charity Navigator and sort of the tools for donors to do their own vetting and their own kind of evaluation of the performance of organizations. And I don't know if you address that in the book, or what your thoughts about overhead and some of these kind of like pop sector ideas about good practices, poor practices, and measures of impact in that sense.
Thanks. So good question. What I would say is that I don't think we really look specifically at that particular issue in the book. What our focus is more so on what are some of the best practices that will make you more attractive to donors, supporters, et cetera. Whether those people are going through a platform like Charity Navigator or coming directly to your website. The research shows that the number of people that are checking out a website before making donations is going up by leaps and bounds, and now it's at about, I think, 30% of all donations, they're checking out your website first. So I would definitely start with your formal web presence. And the reality is that subsector of the nonprofit space is so messy and so complicated, and I'm so glad I don't work in it, because it's like a puzzle that's impossible to solve to everyone's satisfaction. It's kind of like Middle East peace. It's complicated, and so I wouldn't rely too heavily on those tools. I think some people do find those, but the percentage of people that are just going to say like, oh, I just want to address the carbon problem, and then go to Charity Navigator and say who's doing the best job at fighting climate change, are much smaller than the percentage of people that are hearing about the great work 350.org is doing, and then going to their site and looking at the donate page to see what percentage goes to programs versus whatever, where you actually have an opportunity to explain that stuff. So I wouldn't stress too much about those, but they are certainly something to keep an eye on. Okay? So I think that we're out of time for questions. I'm going to stick around for a bit if anybody wants to chat one-on-one. I can hand out cards if people want to follow up with me at any point, and then we've also got some books here if anybody's interested in those. So, but most importantly, like I said earlier, I just want to thank everyone for their time and their attention. I hope this was helpful, and please let me know if I can be of service in any way moving forward. So thanks, everyone.